work. My arrow, there we go. Okay. So the Jackson Soil and Water Conservation District is a local special district. So we're sort of like a fire district or a library or a school district in that we are tax-based and we are a public agency. However, we are non-regulatory. So we know all about local city, municipality, county, state, and federal regulations and laws around natural resources and environmental management, but we don't enforce any of them. So instead, we work voluntarily with landowners or land managers to conserve, protect, and enhance natural resources for the economic, environmental, and quality of life benefits for the residents of Jackson County. And we're pretty fortunate at this district to have a tax base. So we receive a small amount of revenue from all of your property taxes, which allows us to have a fairly sizable staff. We have 9 staff members and also a small grant fund pool, which helps offset some of the costs of what can be very expensive management changes around things like irrigation efficiency and water conservation. So why do we exist? Basically, soil and water conservation districts, there's one that corresponds roughly to a county or a watershed boundary across the country. So every area in the country has a conservation district. If some of you are from Northern or anywhere in California, they're known as resource conservation districts there. But basically, it was born out of the Dust Bowl and the loss of topsoil and collapse of agricultural communities, agricultural economies that came from essentially overexploiting soil resources, water resources, coupled with drought. So a very extended drought that hit kind of the entire country, but the Midwest in particular, and caused massive erosion problems, crop failure, starvation, all of these kinds of issues. So a lot of the practices that I will talk about today were things that what is now the Natural Resource Conservation Service started as the Soil Conservation Service, but a lot of the practices that we try and implement and encourage now are similar to what you might have heard an agricultural conservationist talk about in the 40s and 50s, with refined, better science as well. So like I said, we work directly with private landowners or public landowners or land managers in the county. And we take a landscape approach, a systems level approach to solving problems, and try and design solutions that borrow from the best available science, contextually appropriate practices, so things that would really fit with our ecology, our social landscape, our infrastructural landscape, and also the context of that individual landowner. And we do things like one-on-one site visits to provide technical information and advice on resource management. We write grants both internally with our internal funds and to state and federal agencies. And then we help develop project plans and implement those plans on private property. Oh, sorry, was not supposed to happen. So like I said, I'm going to talk about the existing drought and some of the drought impacts on agricultural production. I have an emphasis on pastures and livestock in this, just because that seems to be the majority of the questions that we receive at the district when it comes to agricultural resource conservation, soil management, land management, but also fruit trees and annual vegetables are a portion of our agricultural landscape in this county. So I'll discuss that a little bit. And then some of the dynamics around managing pastures or managing property during a drought, and in the year or years following a drought. And then Paul will come in to talk about more the water conservation and irrigation efficiency side of things. But first, we would like to hear a little bit from you about your irrigation supply, your irrigation source, the acres that you manage, the crops that you manage for, and how the drought has affected you. So Rachel, did you want me to put up the poll or were you going to?
Let's see. Actually, these are slightly different questions than Paul. Paul just had mostly about the water source. So maybe folks could put, we do have a poll and I'll put that up, but maybe you could answer some of the other questions just by popping things in the chat and we can look at that, but I will put this poll up.
Yeah. That's okay that they're a little bit different. But
yeah. You've got more things there, like the acres, how many acres you have and what crops. So if you want to drop those into the chat, then we can see them there as well, just to get an idea who's in the audience and what you need to know. So is that working? Has anybody taken it? Oh, there we go. One person has done it. So hopefully you see, you should be able to choose more than one thing if that applies to you. And there are 3 questions. The first 2 are part of the same question. They just didn't have enough options for us.
And then once you've finished answering the questions in the poll, if you would like to share the acres that you irrigate or the acres that you manage, and the crops that you manage for, that we can circle around to talking about those at the end. And it gives us an idea of what your goals are as well.
And you can just do that. There's a bubble, should be a bubble at the bottom of your screen if you're on a computer. Sometimes if you just touch a device, it'll pop up somewhere else. You can enter it into chat. So we have had 8 of 13 responses, and sometimes people can't access the poll for whatever reason, but we'll give you a few more moments. So we've got 2 properties, 1 acre, fruit trees, nursery plants, veggies. And we're still at 8. So I'll just give you guys just a couple of minutes. Seconds, really. Well, there's Muriel. Maybe if anybody still needs time, I think we must be done. Yeah, maybe Jake is driving, so we don't want him to do it. Okay. Okay, I think we're probably there. That's 8 for a while, so I'll just end that.
All right.
And share the results for a second. I don't know. Are people seeing the results? You can kind of scroll down, get an idea of who the audience is.
So most on TID or MID, a little bit of Evans Creek, Bear Creek, and then other, but it seems like that was a requirement for getting through the poll. So maybe the other is just to answer it.
Oh, okay. 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 And
a lot of water shut off in July, which would match with the TID and MID shutoffs. Some in June, some had adequate water. So yeah, a lot of different sources of water there. Thanks.
Maybe read quickly through. I think it makes sense to read quickly through the responses here, or I could read them for you. Would that be helpful, Megan?
Sure.
And then people can hear it if they can't see it. So one person says 1 acre fruit trees, nursery plants. Jeannie says could not submit without answer question 2. So okay, so I checked the other. Okay, even though we don't have any other. Okay, that's a weird thing. Lots of water sources, thanks. Also 1+ acre restoration native plants needing water to establish. Water on 6+ acres, no crops yet. not personally managing land, but work with clients who often are on TID and other water sources. Currently, I'm on Ashland City Water and watering a veggie garden. Somebody had trouble with the submit button. Sorry about that, Tricia. Total 45 acres, of which we have 0.1 acre of vineyard, about 24 fruit trees, vegetable gardens, otherwise woods and pastures. Tom Doolittle says 5 acres clover grass on TID, 40 acres of forest property that is rain fed. TID 6.5 acres, of which 5 are irrigated, pasture with donkeys and horses. Drought turned our pasture crispy. Animals are still there, but being fed by hay. Water sources, certified exempt spring, rainwater. And then Tricia, total 36 acres, irrigate with drip on 1 acre from catchment and well, fruit trees, annual garden, native plants to establish, would like to have more in pasture for livestock and native plants. So, oops.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right.
And thank you all for providing that input. That's interesting to hear what everyone is managing for. So as everyone in this space is aware, we are in the midst of a pretty significant drought, maybe a little bit less severe, less extreme, less hazardous here in Jackson County than in Klamath County and to the east of the Cascades, Deschutes area, the Deschutes Basin, and up into Washington and a little bit into Idaho as well. So this is a map, the most current drought conditions map from Oregon Water Resource Department and the USDA Climate Hub of drought conditions across this 3-state area, Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. Here in Jackson County this year, we received the official declaration of a drought emergency relatively early. So the governor signed that declaration on April 13th. The county submitted the request on the last day of March, which meant that the planning and really the motions for declaring a drought happened even earlier. So the very beginning of March, Oregon Water Resource Department actually reached out to us to see if we would support that kind of a request for a declaration, what we were seeing on the ground based on also their measurements at snow-tell sites, so at snow monitoring sites, soil moisture sites, stream flow, all of those kinds of things go into declaring a drought. So to date, we are about 8 inches below average precipitation for the year. And that coupled with a decrease in storage, which Paul will talk about later in reservoir storage, led to the irrigation districts, primarily TID, Talent Irrigation District and Medford Irrigation District, facing the shortest irrigation season in the current period of record. So starting with either reservoir construction or dam repair in the 1950s, this is the shortest irrigation season that we have seen. And that carries impacts to agricultural production, to recreation, to ecosystem health, kind of all of these things that we feel really across the county. And what the drought declaration allowed for the county and for agricultural producers here was to access emergency crop assistance resources and a little bit of extra funding at the county level to help manage water resources. So the drought declaration isn't just a nice piece of paper that we get to show as this perverse badge of conversation, I guess. It actually does carry a lot of assistance for folks in the agricultural world who are producing. I'd like to put this up just to have a sense of where we compare right now in our current drought to historic drought conditions. And while the irrigation season is the shortest on current record, and it was extremely hot, we broke some temperature records, a number of days above 100 degrees this year, and have gone quite a while without precipitation up until the recent couple of weeks. This year is not necessarily as strong of a drought as the 2001 drought, but what makes it more concerning than that particular drought is that it's on the tail end of a couple of other years of pretty significant droughts, and then another period just 5 years back of year upon year of drought conditions. So what we're seeing is more and more frequently we're in some sort of a drought situation with fewer and fewer years that are normal or above, that are average or above average precipitation. So that's just something to keep in mind when you think about management decisions, when you think about the current climate of the county, and how this compares to historical conditions, that the extremes that we're seeing might have occurred historically and even within kind of everyone's collective memory. But what is different is that those extremes are more and more frequent, and the averages or the above averages for precipitation are less and less frequent. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the interacting impacts of climate and drought at the farm level, because it's really hard to discuss these dynamics of our current drought situation in isolation from the broader climate trends and changes, and some of the projected future conditions and future impacts, especially when you're making decisions about land management that are projected out into the future that change what you're going to do next spring, next fall, 5 years down the road if you're changing crops. Being able to keep this in a broader context, I think, is important. So some of the climate influences and events that we are going to see is just an increase in weather disturbances. So increase in individual extreme weather events that cause land management, natural resource, farm level impacts. A season shift, so things like increased growing degree days. So each specific crop or animal or insect pest has a certain number of days above a threshold temperature that it needs to be able to reproduce or carry out some function in its life cycle. And as those increase, that could mean really beneficial things for, say, crop production, where maybe now you could get 2 full seasons of a crop where you used to only have 1. But on the flip side, that also means that things like insect pests, diseases, all of those things have potentially more days above their ideal threshold that they can reproduce and carry out their life cycle events as well. So it's kind of something that producers are going to have to balance with this shift in season. With this, we're also seeing a change in what are known as precipitation regimes. So that's when we receive our precipitation, how much precipitation we receive, and what form that precipitation takes. So in our area, we are going to see and are already seeing more precipitation as rain and less as snow. And that's especially at lower elevations. We're going to see rainfall probably ending earlier in the spring and then starting again later in the fall. And then potentially more of that rainfall is going to come in pulse events and not as spread out throughout the season. And then temperature changes, we'll probably see an increase in average temperature and then also an increase in extreme temperature. So things like the heat dome, is that what they called it? The heat dome this June that caused extreme temperatures across the Pacific Northwest. Those kinds of phenomena will likely become more and more frequent. And I mention all of this, like I said, because managing for this drought doesn't just mean managing this year and managing next year. It means managing years into the future, and what kinds of changes at the farm level or at your property level that you should think about to be able to handle a climatic stress or a climatic event like this year. So that could mean looking at your calendar of land management activities. For a farm, that would be their production calendar. So when a producer would plant, when a cattle producer would try and calve, those kinds of things will change to be earlier or later. And then trying to plan for the unpredictable. So basically this increased variability in events means that planning is going to be more and more difficult because you'll have fewer years or fewer months that are within what used to be the average and what you were accustomed to managing for. So with that, that was a lot of information in a very text-heavy slide, so I apologize, but I think it's important to put this all in the context of future conditions. So back to the present, here's a couple of maps of 2 different soil depths of soil moisture this year, so just a week ago. And I guess, can you see my cursor? I guess you can. So we are right about here in this little corner, or this little corner, and this was taken just after, not this most recent rainfall yesterday, but the rainfall a week ago. And so the map on the left is the root zone moisture indicator, which is the top meter of soil. And so that's what most people who have pasture are managing for, pasture or annual veggies, row crops, potentially most grapevines, many fruit trees, some go a little bit deeper, but that's really what you're concerned about is the rooting depth. And then the surface soil moisture is the top 2 centimeters of soil. And that has interplay with the root zone and can be an indicator of what's going on a little bit deeper in the soil profile. In Oregon, this is zooming in a little bit from earlier in the month, but this shows that we were in much drier, droughttier conditions with this surface soil moisture. So the rain that we got obviously was very helpful in boosting those soil moisture levels, but the top 2 centimeters obviously fluctuate a lot. So if we were to see higher temperatures in the next week or two, we might see this that sort of dry condition return. So thinking about how to manage your property and your land management goals with drought resilience in mind, we can do everything that we can from a management perspective to increase the soil and the plant's ability to respond to drought. But we're starting with a given baseline. So every one of your properties has a certain soil type, and we have a certain climate regime here. That means that we have not an excess, but many properties likely have what are already considered droughty soils. So a droughty soil is actually a soil terminology, and it doesn't have anything to do necessarily with the physical or chemical or biological properties themselves, but basically what it means is that a soil, the balance of water inputs and outputs or demands means that the soils have a higher probability that they're going to dry out during the dry summer months in an average typical year. And these kinds of soils are particularly more vulnerable to damage during drought. So if anyone here has a heavy clay soil, if you've gotten a soil analysis, someone has said you're on coker clay or carney clay, those soils tend to be fairly droughty, and that's where you're going to see those like very widespread cracks, maybe decreased water holding capacity, harder to get water to soak in when you start irrigating or when the first rain of the season comes, those kinds of things. So starting in this map here, we're kind of in this zone, and I apologize for the image quality, but basically in our area here, there is a pretty heavy concentration of droughty soils, somewhat consistent with both our climate and the physical properties of those soils. So what drought basically does is takes those already pre-existing conditions and then exacerbates them in the soil profile, so in the depth of the soil. So the decreased water availability or decreased ability of a soil to hold water impacts all of the soil's biological components. So not just the crop that you're growing for, if you're growing a pasture for grazing or for hay or a vineyard or fruit trees, it's not just going to decrease the water available for those plants, but also for the rest of the soil ecosystem that's part of how those plants end up thriving, producing, and what quality they're able to produce at. So drought tends to lower the water holding capacity of a soil. It decreases the availability of nutrients. So above certain temperatures and without a certain level of moisture, microbes in the soil that are part of the decomposition process of any organic matter, any plant matter that's part of that soil, or manure if you have manure and urine, if you have livestock, all of those critters and microbes that break down those materials to make the nutrients available for plants, all of that slows down under drought conditions and under high heat. It also lowers the ability of a given plant to take up nutrients. Most of the nutrients are water soluble, and the plant actually takes them in by also taking in water, so that capacity is reduced. And then it also increases the risk that any given disturbance will result in a change in physical properties of the soil. So things like compaction or the stability of a soil aggregate. So if any of you have ever dug a soil pit and had a clump of soil, I wish I had some, if I were at the office, I would grab some soil samples from Paul, but the stability of those chunks of soil and how likely they are to potentially disintegrate under any kind of disturbance. And greater aggregate stability tends to mean that you'll have a higher likelihood of that soil staying in place when rains do come again, or a severe wind event or something like that. When you have unstable or unstable aggregates, that's when you increase your risk of erosion, which is detrimental to you as property owners or as agricultural producers, because that means that all those nutrients and beneficial things that are in your soil that you can use are then going to wash away. And then you potentially have to spend more on nutrient inputs to replace them. So that's kind of the cascading system there. So I emphasize talking about soils rather than just pastures or the crop that you're producing from, to really drive home this shift in mindset with management to cultivate soil rather than just the crop at hand, kind of for all of those reasons that I laid out earlier, that it really does start with soil health when it comes to decreasing whatever inputs you might need to purchase to achieve your management goals, and then also to increase resilience against drought. Because the more that you can build up the reservoir of water in your soils, the more resilience you'll have against future drought, which means you'll be able to hold on to more of the water in your soil, keep that sponge full, rather than relying on external water inputs to keep plants or livestock alive. So I found this graphic on, and this is kind of a generalization across the United States, so it's not specific to the Western US, but increasing organic matter in US cropland, so this is probably Midwest or Eastern US, maybe into California, because that's a large portion of our annual vegetable production, but increasing the organic matter in agricultural lands could store potentially the amount of water that flows over Niagara Falls in 150 days. And this doesn't give a flow equivalency, but it is a good kind of visual or like mental picture of how much water soil that has a high organic matter content could store. So there's a few practices, really key practices, that can help you increase the water holding capacity of your soils. And that's something, could be something like intensively managed grazing or rotational grazing, if you've heard that term, which basically means sectioning off a pasture and moving livestock more frequently. things like crop residue, which is basically the amount of plant material that you leave on the surface of the soil. So that could mean with rotational grazing, that means that you're moving your animals before they've grazed below 6 inches to really preserve the integrity of the forage. Or it could be if you're cutting hay, you're cutting to leave a little bit more on the ground. And that just increases the ability of those plants to bounce back under drought conditions. You could be cover cropping. So if any of you are hemp or marijuana producers, or in your gardens, that's spreading out some sort of a grass, pea, legume, brassica mix during the winter to keep soils in place and to build up organic matter, or rotating crops. So some of the impacts that we see from drought to forages, so specifically focused on pastures in my talk here, but lower yields. We've heard anecdotally from folks in the valley that produce for hay that they're seeing anywhere from a 25% to a 75% reduction in yield due to, that's with irrigation and longer season irrigation. So folks that are on EPID or RRVID and had a longer irrigation season, the soil moisture profile was so greatly reduced and the temperatures were so extreme that their yields were much lower. And then the yields that you do get are going to have a lower nutritional quality. They'll have less protein. They'll be less palatable to livestock. You'll probably see less robust growth. And then in terms of making any kind of a management change with drought, you tend to have generally unfavorable conditions for new seeding establishments. So it makes it just more challenging to come back from that disturbance. Some of the impacts of drought on livestock, it varies with the life stage of the animal and what type of animal, what breed of that animal. Generally, younger animals are more sensitive to drought impacts and extreme temperatures than older animals. But things like decreased weight gain, if any of you have goats or cows for milk or for dairy, lower production, lower nutrient content in that production, and then just kind of broad nutrient deficiencies or malnourishment because animals just can't get a high enough quality of forage, and then increased incidence of disease and sensitivity to those specific diseases. To reiterate some of the management decisions for pastures during a drought. Like I said, many of you are probably starting with droughty soils to begin with. So the pre-existing condition of the soil plus a drought makes it so that all of your property that you're managing basically is that much more sensitive to any kind of a disturbance. So with grazing, any kind of hoof action or those animals eating forages down makes it much more difficult for the soils and the plants to bounce back. So things that you can do are to decrease your grazing time and particularly don't continuously graze. So this photo at the bottom is an example of this rotational grazing model where the producer just divided the pasture into long paddocks. And you can see is moving the animals across, and the pastures that they were just in on the left are, you can kind of tell by the color quality of the pasture, but they've been eaten down a little bit more, and now they're in taller forage, and that just allows the plants enough rest time to regrow. For horses specifically, during drought conditions, and if you manage small acres with horses, to consider them as an exercise area and not as your primary source of feed. Most properties that we see around the valley have too many animals for their size and sort of productive capacity given the irrigation amount and system. And really expecting robust forage out of those needs a little bit of a tweak in mindset. Also, moving livestock more frequently, so increasing the forage height before you move them out of a pasture. So from 4 to 6 inches, maybe you're looking at 6 to 8 inches instead. Give pastures longer rest periods to recover from that disturbance. Further subdividing pastures, so you're moving animals even more frequently to increase rest, reducing the stocking rate. So maybe you need to find other land to lease or to cull whatever herd that you're managing, and then being prepared to supplement feed, which recognize can be a hardship, especially with such a widespread drought. We're seeing very widespread increase in hay costs. So. Another piece to keep in mind is to manage your pasture for drought in the year after the drought. So the impact to your property, to the soils, to the forages, doesn't end when the drought declaration is over. So just because it rains this winter and maybe we get average to above average precipitation, which would be wonderful, the impacts of that drought last beyond just the drought year. So plan to implement some of these same management practices next year, coming out of the drought, in order to restore or even just maintain the forage quality that you had before. So that could be to delay grazing in the spring. Maybe you keep animals in a sacrifice or a heavy use area for longer, to allow a little bit more growth, more tillering of grasses, which is where you see, like, from one grass plant, you'll see multiple little shoots starting to come off, and the more of that you can cover on the soil increases those plants' ability to produce. You might need to purchase more fertilizers or other nutrient inputs, amendments, manure, whatever you use. You might see new weedy species start to establish and grow that you'll need to control. And then you might see parts of your pasture that have died, and you're going to need to reseed in areas where you've really got an impact in the stand cover or loss of a pasture component if you knew that you had multiple grass and legume species beforehand. Very briefly, some impacts on other crops. And I'm not going to go too into depth on this just because it's not a question that we receive often, but we can come back to it if you do have questions. But basically similar impacts across plants that we cultivate. So things like decreased yield and productivity of individual plants, decreased nutrient quality of what is grown, what is produced. Plants might shut down earlier in the growing season. And I was just reading a little bit more about, I was kind of unfamiliar with this topic, but in drought and extreme temperature conditions, it's a lower probability with many of our annual vegetable crops, so things like tomatoes or peppers or anything like that, a lower probability that those will get pollinated, even though pollinators might be present. And then a lower probability that that pollinated flower results in a fruit. It's kind of like a cascading thing. So a lower probability that it gets pollinated, a lower probability that that pollinated flower will actually start to become a fruit, and then a lower probability that that fruit will make it to maturity. So you might see things like blossom end rot, if you've seen that on your tomatoes or your peppers, which results from increased cycles of a plant going into a wilt kind of a stage. So that's an indication of water shortage. All of those kinds of things. So a lot of those changes on this slide, so managing a pasture during a drought, managing a pasture the year after a drought, are also things to implement even more long-term to adapt to conditions of future drought. So a lot of these changes to start taking now on your property will hold equally true, if not more so, in conditions of more frequent or more extreme drought. So there's some other things that you can do in a long-term sense to adapt to differing or lessened precipitation availability or irrigation availability. And that could be things like switching crops, so switching forages, planting varieties of grasses and legumes that are more drought adapted or even dryland adapted, and shifting a mindset from an irrigated pasture to a dryland pasture management, practicing intensively managed grazing or rotational grazing, potentially switching the species or breed of livestock to be more adapted to drought or extreme temperatures. So maybe instead of sourcing cattle stock from the Willamette Valley, for instance, you're looking towards Central or Southern California. Diversifying crops, so increasing the number of species and types of species in a pasture or in your crop rotation. And then what Paul will talk about next is increasing irrigation efficiency. That kind of just reiterates what I talked about. And I will drop some links in the chat for these 3 places that you can look for recommendations or resources on current and projected climate conditions and current drought conditions. Thanks for listening. I know that was a lot of information in a short amount of time. I'm happy to answer any questions right now or after this presentation.
Great, thanks, Megan. Give me a minute to pull up my slides here.
While Paul is doing that, if anyone has a question that they want to ask specifically to me or what I presented, feel free to drop it in the chat and I can address it before we kind of switch gears.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Megan. Yeah, while me and Megan were talking about drought, and given that we do a lot of site visits with landowners in Jackson County, especially this year regarding irrigation projects, focusing on soil management is a big piece, because if you're out of water, like a lot of you were this year, being on TID or MID, having a good, healthy soil is really going to carry you through to the next season, regardless of how much water there is. And all signs and all data seem to point to that there's going to be less water in the future rather than more water in the future. So thanks, Megan, for covering all that. So my presentation is water conservation and drought. My name is Paul DeMaggio. And I'm going to look at existing water storage and some precipitation outlooks, as accurate as they may be, for this upcoming winter, so you can plan for next year. And then I'll talk about water conservation and irrigation efficiency projects and practices. This is a large topic, and there's a lot of projects and practices that can be done. And a lot of times it's on an individual basis on your own farm and on your own field. So encourage you after this presentation to reach out to me and Megan, and we can set up a site visit and come out and look at your specific situation and help you with your goals. I know we've already been out to a couple of your places here. I see some familiar faces on the presentation. So drought. In the irrigation world, deficiency of precipitation over an extended period resulting in water shortage. We've seen a meteorological drought, which is less rainfall, and that has resulted in some of these drought conditions we see now: agricultural, hydrological, socioeconomic, and ecological. And I like to refer to the drought and flood events as normal events. They happen and are a normal part of your weather and a normal part of your planning as a rancher and as a person who uses irrigation water. You should plan on being in drought and flood conditions. So departure from normal is really, it should be departure from average whenever we're talking about these things. So we're in this area here, hydrological drought. We're seeing reduced stream flows, reduced reservoir levels. It can be having an impact on wildlife, wetlands, and then trickling down here, we're seeing economic impacts from these droughts. People are, quitting the farming operation because of the droughts. There's social impacts, communities can run out of drinking water, environmental impacts, less water for habitats in the streams. And in Jackson County, most of our irrigation water is surface water. So it's easy to see and visualize our drought situation. You can just drive up to Immigrant Lake, or you can go look at an empty canal and you can see the water moving around or not moving around. There's a couple groundwater irrigators in the area in Central Point, Medford area, but the majority of irrigation in Jackson County and Josephine County is done through surface water irrigation. So I'm going to touch on just water in Jackson County, where it comes from. Some of you mentioned you are on TID and MID, so I'll focus on where you get your water so that you can be knowledgeable when you talk about ways that those organizations can be more efficient with their water and extend the irrigation season. So here's a map of the Rogue Basin project by U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. Here's Ashland Talent. Here's Immigrant Lake, Hyatt, and Howard. So Talent Irrigation District covers this portion here around Talent and Ashland. Medford Irrigation District covers a little further down here. And Rogue River Valley Irrigation District picks up this area down by Central Point. And water for TID comes from many sources. So there's a lot of trans-basin water delivery. So it actually, water gets picked up here in the South Fork Little Butte Creek watershed, flows through some canals into Howard Prairie Lake. Howard Prairie stores snowpack later in the season, and then delivers water down to Immigrant Lake, and Hyatt Reservoir also delivers water down to Immigrant Lake. Howard and Hyatt lakes are in the Klamath River Basin. So there's another trans basin. There's a tunnel here that pulls water from these sources into the Bear Creek Basin, and then goes through a power plant, generates some renewable energy before supplementing Immigrant Lake. And then here is where water comes out of Immigrant to feed Ashland Canal, or to feed the TID Canal. The Ashland Canal behind Ashland bypasses Immigrant Lake and picks water directly up from Howard and Hyatt. Medford Irrigation District water comes from 4 Mile Lake and Fish Lake, comes down Little Butte Creek, gets picked up in this canal here, and comes all the way around this way. Medford Irrigation District only uses less than 10% of the water stored in these reservoirs. MID uses mostly water from this watershed here, 4 Mile and Fish Lake. And again, 4 Mile Lake is in the Klamath River Basin. So a lot of our water that we're using is actually in another watershed, which is interesting and requires additional partnerships and additional conversations to have regarding drought considerations and water usage. Here's the existing water levels for that project that I showed in more of a schematic here. So all these reservoirs here that supply TID are what they call a dead pool, which means they're at the minimum amount. They can't withdraw any more water. The water is below the outlet pipes of these reservoirs. Combined, these reservoirs are about at 7% of normal of what they would be this time of year. So maybe this time of year, they'd be about 30–40% full. Here's Immigrant Lake, the current water year from October to about October. The red line is the average reservoir storage. And this blue line is what we saw this year. The green line is what we saw last year. And it's, again, it's right at the bottom. So we're not starting anywhere close to where we should be for the beginning of next year. 4 Mile Lake, which supplies Medford Irrigation District and Rogue River Valley Irrigation District, is a little bit less than what it was last year, and a lot less than what it is in an average year. So we can't expect to see another short water year for MID and RRVLD. Just north of the Bear Creek area is the Big Butte Creek Basin, and this is Willow Lake here. Willow Lake is 46% full, and it's a little bit less than what it was last year, and it's about average. So it's interesting that that area had either higher rainfall or they had a little bit different water year than we did in the more southern area of the county. Oh, Willow Lake supplies Eagle Point Irrigation District, and they have had a full normal or full average water season this year. You can see this blue line here, the lake gets full, and then once they're unable to meet their full withdrawals from Big Butte Creek, they start releasing water from the lake, and they release it out of the lake at a steady rate all the way until they shut off releases and then come back the next year. So all those reservoirs we looked at are managed by the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. These two are managed by U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, primarily for flood control. Lost Creek Reservoir, Lost Creek Lake, and Applegate Reservoir, Applegate Lake. And these are at very low values as well. So there's Applegate Reservoir. This is the rule curve is what it's called, the water control diagram. This red line represents where they try to get the water to in a normal year for flood protection. They want to have it low here so that in January, February, March, they can fill the reservoir and prevent flooding downstream in Applegate. And you can see that happen this year. This green line here represents the rainfall that happened, big rainfall events, and the inflow that surged into the reservoir. But this light blue line shows that the actual amount that was in Applegate River was only about 600 CFS, whereas if there was no reservoir there, the flow would have been 2,500 CFS. Concurrently, later in the season right now, the inflow to the Applegate Reservoir is about 20 CFS, but the outflow into Applegate River is 140 CFS. So if the reservoir wasn't there, the Applegate River would be 10 times less flow than what it is now. There's another interesting graph about Applegate Reservoir levels from 2007 to now. And you can see there was a dip in 2015 when we had a low water year. And then again, 2020 and 2021, the reservoir didn't fill up. And so we're looking like it could continue that way the next couple of years. Lost Creek Reservoir, similar story. It's very low. It hasn't filled up to this red line. And you can see here the inflow into the reservoir is about 600 right now, but the outflow was at about 1,500 for June, July, and August to meet all the demands on the Rogue River. And then it's since dropped down to about 1,000. Lost Creek, between 2007 and 2021, it filled up each year. There were some years it got low, but it filled up again. This was in 2015. But this year, it's looking even worse. It didn't fill up in 2020, and it's even lower than what it was before. Here's a precipitation outlook for January, February, March from NOAA, National Oceanic Atmospheric Association. Oregon is here, and it's looking like Jackson County, Oregon, Southern Oregon, and Northern California have equal chances of probability in that time. So that means it could be worse. We could have below chances of precipitation. We could be entering into another even worse water year, but it's looking like it's going to be about normal. Take this seasonal precipitation outlook with a grain of salt. Equal chances, so that's you're flipping a coin, whether or not you're going to be below normal or above normal. Okay, now I'll talk a little bit about water conservation, irrigation efficiency, and what that means, what those terms mean. Are you being efficient? Are you conserving water? People throw around those terms a lot. And I like to think about it. You can be 100% efficient with your water if you are trying to grow one potted plant and you hand water it when it starts to get droopy, and you're very efficient with that water. All of that water is going towards keeping that plant alive. There's no runoff. There's very little evaporation. You're not wasting any of it. You're almost at 100% efficiency. So efficiency doesn't necessarily translate to much unless you put it in a larger scale of what's happening on your farm or in the irrigation district itself. So water conservation is reducing the amount of water needed to produce the same amount of agricultural production. An example of this would be piping a canal and placing the conserved water back in stream for habitat, or leaving the conserved water in the reservoir or keeping it in the groundwater source. So you are physically not pulling water out of the stream or out of the source, and you're maintaining the same agricultural production as you had previously. Irrigation efficiency is increasing the amount of agricultural production with about the same amount of water use. So this could be switching from flood irrigation to sprinkler irrigation on an irrigation district. TID is going to deliver you about the same amount of water, and you're paying for the same amount of water, regardless of if you're a flood irrigator or a sprinkler irrigator. You can take it at different times. If you're a sprinkler irrigator, you can take it whenever you want. But generally, you're taking about the same amount of water. But what you're benefiting from irrigation efficiency is you're seeing an increased crop yield, increased agricultural production from that same amount of water. You're not necessarily conserving water. You're just getting more crop per drop of that water that's available to you. So other ways to do that besides switching from flood to sprinkler would be just irrigation water management, using soil moisture monitors, flow meters, irrigation scheduling, really managing the soil moisture content and the crop water use, rather than just dumping water on when it's convenient or when it's available to you. And irrigation efficiency improvements can lead to water conservation, but only if there's a measurable reduction in water usage and you physically don't pull out that much water. So make sure when we're talking about irrigation efficiency and water conservation that those two terms don't get too mixed up. In fact, I was just looking at while I was listening to Megan's slide, the Ashland Canal piping project, which is the one where they're going to work with the city of Ashland to pipe a portion of TID's canal. And that canal leaks about 23% of its water. And so by piping it, they would increase the efficiency of that canal from what it is now, about 78% to about 100%. So that'd be the canal efficiency would increase. The conserved water in that case would stay in the reservoir. So if they were able to conserve water, they could pull less water from the reservoir to fill that same canal. And then they could extend the irrigation season a week or two by conserving that water in the reservoir and releasing it at a later time. But I just looked it up. I was wondering what happened with that project. It looked like it got stalled in 2019, and the Ashland board or whoever was in charge of that decided not to go forward with the project. There may have been too many social concerns with that project. Conservation planning, which brings that up, is how I think about it with irrigation is to optimize your production per unit of input. I'm not looking to maximize the production of your crop. Maximizing production would be maximizing the amount of water that's available, maximizing the amount of fertilizer you put on, maximizing the labor. We're looking to optimize production, meaning planning for less water available, working with partners, being able to come to win-win solutions and having dialogues between water users, such as municipalities and environmental uses, and to optimize the production of each of those by doing better planning or more planning and looking at ways to increase the efficiency of your water use to optimize your production. And you can't manage it if you can't measure it. Many of the drought solutions that are happening now in California and in the Western states, they're pushing hard to manage more of the water resource. So that's either with satellites, managing snowpack and soil moisture, or more management systems and measurement devices on creeks and streams and tributaries, better management, better measurement on irrigation districts. I know the irrigation districts in our area, MID specifically, have expressed interest in wanting to get better management of their water so they can waste less water through management. Okay, so what's the water conservation projects? So individual landowners can do water conservation projects. And mainly this happens if you are a larger water user that's pulling directly from a creek. I saw one person in the poll said they may have been pulling from Evans Creek or in that area. But the other folks who are on an irrigation district, water conservation isn't really a topic for you because any less water that you use per year is really just going to go to another irrigator, or it's going to go somewhere else. So you're not really physically moving that saved water somewhere that can be managed, potentially. There's millions of dollars spent every year in Oregon through these different agencies. I've worked, NRCS works in our office. We've gotten U.S. Bureau of Reclamation Water Smart grants. We just finished the Oregon Water Resource Department project. And I've worked with Farmers Conservation Alliance and the Rogue River Valley Irrigation, or excuse me, Rogue River Watershed Council is in our office. So if you want to know more information about water conservation projects, the Three Sisters Irrigation District is one of the main poster projects for this topic. It's really one of the first and major projects in Oregon. It is really a win-win. Restored 30 CFS of water into Lychus Creek, and this is in Central Oregon there. They were the first ones to use this flexible, high-density polyethylene pressurized pipeline. And the project was a huge success, multiple project partners, and it's still ongoing. Water conservation locally. I worked on the Hopkins Canal pipeline project with Rogue River Valley Irrigation District. That was completed a couple of years ago. They were able to put conserved water back in Little Butte Creek during certain times of year and certain water years. They were able to extend their irrigation season by about 2 weeks with this short 3 mile pipeline because they were able to divert less water and release less water from the reservoirs. And so they stored water in the reservoirs longer later in the season, and then they could release it later because they were efficient with this piping system. And the other one was this individual landowner who had water directly from Gulls Creek. And they were able to put some conserved water back in Gulls Creek to trade for some funds for a capital improvement project to be efficient. So these are water conservation projects, but they're also irrigation efficiency projects. Irrigation efficiency projects aren't necessarily water conservation projects. You're looking for more crop per drop, you're optimizing production, which is I think what most of us here are looking at doing is, we have a limited water supply from either our rain tanks or our wells, or we get, a small amount of water from TID, or we get water only in the spring from TID and MID. And how can we get the most crop per drop of that water that's available to us? So not really looking to reduce the water usage, just to optimize our water usage. In our irrigation efficiency project we worked on, we've increased efficiency. That was about 30 to 50% when it was wild contour flood irrigation, up to about 70 to 80% center pivot sprinklers. So, upwards of a big efficiency increase there, which directly leads to increase in yields. And then also with the elimination of flood irrigation runoff, we see a big reduction in water quality inputs to creeks and streams, such as bacteria, phosphorus, sediment, and temperature. But in these two cases, they didn't reduce the total amount of water that they used. They had a limited supply of water, and they're trying to be as efficient as possible with the water to get the most crop per drop, and to do it in a way that's improves water quality for others. So all that being said, we can help with irrigation efficiency and water conservation projects. We can measure water quality. We can work with irrigation districts on larger pipeline projects, and we can work with individual farmers and ranchers on irrigation efficiency projects. So thank you. That's the end of my presentation there. I know I went through a lot. Thanks for listening. Hope you guys came away with some useful information for you on your own fields. I know this is a big topic, but I would encourage you to talk to the irrigation districts about water conservation projects. Support water conservation projects as you can, such as piping canals. That's a good way to modernize these irrigation systems, to increase efficiency and to conserve water, and to act as ways to be more drought resilient. So with that, I guess we'll start answering some questions.
Paul, thank you so much. My name is Marcy Kamiker. I'm the chair of the Education Committee. Rachel is having some technical difficulties. She's been able to hear the whole presentation, but she can't view it. So she's asked me to take over reading the questions to our speakers. So sure. Thank you so much, Paul and Megan. First question that was asked was, what years do they take into account for what is considered normal, for normal amount of rainfall or irrigation?
I guess I'll field that first. It's usually the last 30 years is what they look at, the running average of that last 30 years. And again, normal is, it's normal to have droughts and wet periods, so it's really an average amount. Yeah, so it is, the last 30 years is a pretty standard amount.
Okay, great. What is the percentage of TID water that comes from the Klamath River watershed? There's also the consideration that leaky TID ditches may be contributing to water table recharge in some areas of the valley. So just a consideration for those who turn to well water use when TID is turned off early.
Yeah, definitely. We do know how much water they pull from the Klamath Basin. I'd have to look up those numbers, but it is a significant amount. They get a lot of water from the Little Butte Creek Basin that flows into the Klamath Basin, and then that flows back into the Bear Creek area. So it gets mixed, and yeah, it requires a lot of coordination between the Klamath area and TID regarding that water use. But in that basin, the water that's in that basin would end up below many of the irrigators in the Klamath area. So even though it's technically the Klamath Basin, it's really not contributing to many of the water shortages that they are experiencing now, which are higher up in the Klamath Basin. And then, yeah, this question has come up a lot with shallow wells, with piping canals. So those canals do seep water into shallow groundwater. But that water is inherently town irrigation district's water, and they have the ability to manage it as they should for irrigation, which is the purpose of that water, and it's the purpose of the reservoirs. The purpose of that water isn't to fill domestic shallow groundwater wells, because for customers who aren't paying for that town irrigation district water. So it is a concern that needs to be addressed anytime there's a piping project. But it's also one where it's, unfortunate that landowners who have shallow wells that have been pulling from that shallow well for a long time have to adjust their well. But if those conditions are brought up to begin with before a piping project, the cost for that can sometimes be included in the cost of piping the canal. For example, with the...
Can you please turn on this light a little bit?
For example, with the Klamath dam removal projects, where they're going to remove about 4 dams in the Klamath system, obviously the water levels in those lakes are going to drop significantly. And all those houses around the lakes have shallow wells, and they're going to have to mitigate for that. And so they have talked to all the surrounding folks and looked at all the wells and figured out which wells need to be deepened or which ones need to be adjusted. And so that's included in the project. So yeah, good question, but that shouldn't be a barrier to piping an irrigation canal.
Okay. Someone else asked, how much more water is going to hemp and pot rather than growing vegetables and food in Jackson County?
I can take.
You also have to include grapes or hops in that conversation too. Other non-edible crops, right? Yeah.
Right. I can take that question. We get that a lot from both people in natural resource professions, colleagues that we work with, and from the general public, trying to point a lot of the pin the blame for water shortages on hemp and marijuana production. And while it is true that there is a fairly significant rate of water rights violations amongst hemp and marijuana producers in this county and in Josephine County, hemp and marijuana is actually a far more water efficient crop than irrigated pasture, particularly flood irrigated pastures. So much of the areas down, at least in Ashland and Talent area, that were converted into hemp or marijuana grows were previously in flood irrigated pasture, and now provided that they're within their water right, the hemp and marijuana producers are likely using less water or using that water more efficiently than the previous system. And I really like pinpoint this piece of the argument, not because I want to defend illegal use of water or illegal production of a crop, but because putting blame on those particular agricultural producers or water users distracts from the real drivers of our current water situation. So there might be some localized impacts that are more closely tied to growing hemp or pot or hemp or marijuana or hops or grapes, but it's not the overwhelming driver of our water situation.
That's really interesting because I think the prevailing view is otherwise.
Right. Right. It's a hard myth to dispel. The crop or the water demands for cannabis are fairly similar to tomatoes or to corn. So
Very interesting.
and the irrigation system that they're using is far more efficient. So the amount of water that comes out of a drip